My name is Philip Oldfield. I'm the head of school here at UNSW Built Environment, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth instalment of Impact at BE. And as many of you know, Impact at BE is our lecture series celebrating the work our researchers do with industry and communities to tackle some of the greatest challenges that we're facing in society today, both in our cities and our regions. Before I go on, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Bejigal land today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to elders both past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us either in person or online. Today's talk is called Future-Proofing Residential Development in Western Sydney, and we're lucky enough to have 4 speakers today. Firstly, Dr. Anir Upadhyay, who's a lecturer in architecture here at UNSW. Nick Asher, who's an associate in sustainability at WSP. Judith Berinsma, who's a project coordinator at the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils. And Kelly G is a policy and projects officer at Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils. So without further ado, I will pass over, I believe, to Anir.
Thanks, Phil. I'm really excited to present our work today. It's a great initiative from the BE to showcase our work with the industry and our partners. So to start this talk, I'll invite Julie to start with, and then everyone will present slowly after that. Please, Julie.
Thank you so much for the invite to present today. We've been working quite closely with the team here at UNSW on a lot of our heat work, and today we wanted to highlight one of the projects we've been working on. Just starting off with UNSW has been absolutely instrumental in guiding the work that we're doing in urban heat. So, without further ado, Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils, WestRoC, we represent councils in Western Sydney. We advocate on behalf of our councils and our communities on a whole range of issues. And quite a few years ago, in about 2016, heat became more and more of an issue. Our councils really heard on the ground through their communities that heat was a growing issue, and councils really realised that they alone are not able to address this. So they worked with us to look at cross-sectoral collaboration to tackle this issue across the board. So that's where we started with our Turn Down the Heat program. So Turn Down the Heat was an initiative that we started together with 55 other organisations across Sydney that really looks at taking a holistic and cross-sectoral approach to tackling heat, the issue that is heat for Western Sydney and extending to Greater Sydney. We've since been, so that strategy was released in 2018, and we've since been working together with a whole range of stakeholders to implement initiatives to tackle heat. But I wanted to start with basics because even when we started on our heat journey, we do feel that sometimes these 3 issues get conflated. So just stepping it all back, what do we mean when we talk about heat? So when we're talking about heat, we're kind of talking about these 3 things. So they're all interrelated, but we need to really understand that when we're talking about climate change and that increasing temperature, when we're talking about urban heat islands, or when we're talking about heat waves, while interrelated, they have different causes and they do require different solutions. So we do feel that we need to be absolutely aware of this because when we do talk about heat, often people jump to let's plant trees, let's do greening. That is not going to be enough. Understanding the issue allows us to actually think about this issue way more broadly and also think about some of those other solutions that we really need to start implementing. And just again to highlight the importance of this issue, we know that heat kills more Australians than fire, flood and storms combined, and our communities keep raising heat as an issue more and more, even putting it on par with bushfire in terms of their concern. We know that heat has cascading impacts across all systems of our city, so we need to be really careful and really understand how we're trying to address this issue at multiple scales. So again, when we started on this journey of looking at heat, initially we started going around in circles. What issue were we trying to address? Were we trying to keep people safe? Are we trying to reduce temperatures? Again, different things requiring different solutions. So this resilience approach that you can see here on the right-hand side has really allowed us to think through the issue of heat a lot more holistically. And this framework was actually developed in consultation with UNSW researchers as well. So while it looks super simple, it actually, when you go into the issue, it becomes more complex really, really quickly. So what we mean, stepping through that framework, when we're talking about awareness, we really need to understand the issue, to understand the scale of the issue. So to do that, we're talking about doing risk assessments. We're talking about doing engagement with communities. And we're talking about really sort of understanding and unpacking the issue and underlying conditions and risk at a place when we're talking about heat. When we're talking about reduce, it's about what can we do to reduce those temperatures as much as we can. So it's about reducing emissions to sort of battle climate change, but it's also about tackling that urban heat island effect. So what can we do in the urban environment? However, we also know that there's going to be that residual risk to our community. So we know that we need to be adapting our environment, be adapting our communities as well to make sure that they are comfortable and safe in a continuing warming climate. And we need to, as a city, as a system, be able to respond when things go wrong. We've already seen 50-degree days in Penrith. Those events can impact millions of people. What do we do when power fails? Are we ready to respond to that? What does that mean for our community? So we need to start thinking about when things go wrong, how can we prepare for that? So like I said, 2018, we launched our Turn Down the Heat strategy, and we've been working on implementing programs ever since. Westrock is a very small organisation, so we rely very much on working with all our stakeholders, with our research partners, and we do rely on external funding as well to do what we do. Basically, my colleague Kelly, who will speak in a minute, and myself, we've been sort of working in this space. So I think our strength has been to work with all these stakeholders across the region and to connect up different initiatives across the city as well. So what you see here are some of the projects that we have been implementing so far. We've shaded in blue those 3 projects, and those 3 projects are key projects that we've been delivering in the design and urban development space. And all 3 of these projects have been absolutely done in collaboration with UNSW and also other stakeholders as well. So I'll touch upon them really, really quickly, and then we'll delve into that last one that we're really sort of looking to unpack a little bit more with Dr. Anir today. So the Urban Heat Planning Toolkit, setting minimum standards in planning policy will become really, really important. However, this is a very new space in planning policy. While there's a lot of research out there, we kind of know theoretically what needs to be done to cool down that urban environment. Translating that into planning policy is actually really hard, and it had not been done before. Councils were asked a few years ago to do this, to actually integrate heat resilience into their planning policies, and there was no precedent here in New South Wales. So we've been working with UNSW and other partners and stakeholders to really do that translation. Councils, the first urban heat clauses have now made their way into planning legislation, which we're extremely excited about. But we also know that a lot of development actually bypasses council, so there's a lot more that needs to be done to tackle that whole planning environment. Cool Suburbs is a design and assessment tool that really looks at heat resilience. We've been working again with a science panel, including UNSW, to translate the latest science into practical application that policymakers but also developers can use to design big master plan communities down to single lots. So what gives you the best bang for buck in terms of heat resilience when you're looking for design? So that is the first tool that really sort of tries to bring all of those bits and pieces together, the water sensitive urban design, the green space, the material choices down to sort of that individual home level. That tool is currently live, coolsuburbs.com.au, and free to download, and we are looking to expand that to the whole of New South Wales in the next 12 months and make that a lot more user friendly. That's now also integrated in the Green Star community credits as well. The next one is future-proofing residential development. So that's a really exciting project. So while there's been a lot of focus on the urban design and how to reduce temperatures through urban design, there has been less focus on what it actually means to the individual to stay safe and to stay cool in a warmer climate, but also during extreme heat events. Well, there's a lot that we can do through sort of that strategic planning, through planning and design, actually looking at that individual home and at an individual dwelling, making sure that people can stay safe in that space is going to be incredibly important, especially down the track when we see more extreme events hitting our city. So this project was implemented obviously with the fabulous team here at UNSW, WSP, together with our council partners, Blacktown City Council, Hawkesbury City Council and Liverpool City Council, and was funded through the New South Wales Government and Local Government New South Wales. So I will now hand over to Nick, sorry I had to check that, to Nick from WSP, who's been assisting us with implementing this project.
Great, thanks Judith. Is everybody happy, Ania, mainly if we just follow from your slides that are on the screen, or shall I flip over, Ania? I think we'll go with these. Let's go with it as it is. Yeah. Thanks for having me to speak today, and thanks to the uni for hosting this event. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes to speak about the work that we were involved with that preempted or preceded this project with Westrock and the university. And it was to do with a study in the Eastern Sydney context. So this was a study for the Eastern Sydney councils led by Waverley Council, and some of the prompting for why this study was taken up was the recognition of the projected rises in global temperatures due to climate change. The aim was to assess the performance of so-called compliant building designs against what those projected future climate scenarios would be, and to determine the effects of climate change on that compliant building thermal performance, looking at factors associated with energy consumption, greenhouse gases, and water demand. So the study used the compliance tool, which is BASICS in New South Wales, to look at the basic score areas of thermal comfort, energy, and water. Maybe we just jump to the next slide, please. So the general approach we took in that study was to look at a variety of building typologies. As you can see there, they ranged from typical standalone detached houses through to high-rise multi-unit development. And the aim was to actually look at 3 different climate scenarios. So they were the representation of current climate used in the regulatory tools for present day, and then also looking at 2030 and 2070 future scenarios under what's known as the RCP 8.5 concentration pathway, which effectively represents the very extreme of climate change projections, because that is the trajectory that global climate appears to currently be on. Taking a look at the heating and cooling loads that are assessed through what's known as the NatHERS tool for assessing these things. NatHERS produces a star rating, and also out of that rating we obtain heating and cooling loads that contribute to the BASICS thermal comfort scoring. In addition, we also looked at BASICS energy and water scoring in the case of these future climate scenarios. And we undertook what was effectively a qualitative assessment of energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, and also water consumption. So next slide, please. What we came out of with the thermal comfort assessment in particular, and this is of relevance to the work that was then done for the Western Sydney area, is this thermal comfort assessment for current day or current climate files and then the future. And this was probably one of the most striking charts that came out of that study, which was, if you look at the first of the group of 3 bars for each typology, we saw a generally rough balance between heating and cooling demand for your typical compliant house. As you moved out to 2030, the overall loads for heating and cooling didn't change a lot, but the balance shifted greatly towards more cooling compared to heating. But then when you reached the 2070 climate conditions, it was very, very noticeable that pretty much everything switched to cooling energy demand only, with negligible heating. And so this spelled an interesting situation to deal with in the consideration of current day buildings that would probably still be around in 2070, and how the experience of thermal comfort would be in those dwellings. Just one more slide, please. So out of that finding, the study did prompt a similar interest from Westrock for the Western Sydney area, because if that was the findings for the Eastern Sydney area, which is a so-called fairly benign and temperate climate, we do know that Western Sydney experiences much more extremes, in particular heat, and so an assessment for Western Sydney was undertaken, following a similar sort of approach with different building typologies, but looking at 4 specific climate scenarios, and they were the current climate that's in the regulatory tools at present, what was deemed the 2022 climate, which is the proposed climate setup for the next iteration of basics and the regulatory tools under the NCC, and then a 2030 and a 2050 scenario, again under that same concentration pathway. The aim here was to evaluate it with a bit more granularity, some of the proposed regulatory changes, but also to capture that mid-range timeframe at 2050 rather than going right out to 2070. The study focused on just the heating and cooling loads coming out of the NatHERS assessment. And one of the additional studies that was focused on was looking at a heatwave scenario and survivability and conditions under heatwave conditions. So like I said, focusing mainly on the thermal comfort, there was no consideration of energy or water scoring in basics for this particular study. And so final slide, I think, is to hand over to Anir in a moment, but the assessment methodology for Western Sydney was to, again, model each representative building type to bring it up to what would be current day minimum compliance, take those same models and test them against the proposed 2022 weather files, which are coming into effect soon, and then to repeat that process with the future scenarios, recording and comparing those resulting heating and cooling loads for the scenarios, and evaluating those against a heatwave scenario. And the heatwave scenario was defined through a weather file that was compiled specifically to test a heatwave scenario, and the results were then evaluated from all of that study. So I think that's my point to hand over from industry to the university, and I believe this is back to you now, Anir.
Thanks, Nick. With that background, I think it really give me opportunity to present the findings and what we observed in this research. So just to start with what I would like to, before going into the results, I would like to give a bit of context. And the context here is climate is changing, we all know, but how it's changing, particularly in Western Sydney, is something I would like to highlight. And what you see here is annual temperature, which is presented from 2000 onwards, but it is ranked for last 50 years. And what you see, main focus here is, like the deep red, which is, like numbered as 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see that within 4 consecutive years. So, which happened 16 to 19, and that is what's worrying us. So we are really into that trajectory, and then what you'll see 2021, 46 So we just kind of like going a roller coaster ride. And so just it really gives an idea of what we are experiencing in recent days. And if we look at the major data and project it, this is what you will see. So you can see temperature change is really going a bit exponential. And in that sense, when we're talking about current climate, I think we need to put a line somewhere where we are now, rather than, you know, like the NatHERS approach. I'll come back to in a moment. So if we take it somewhere close to 2020, I think that's where our current climate is. And then this is, I'll take a few moments to explain this in detail. It's a bit, you know, like busy slide. When I looked at the, just continuing from the previous one, I looked at the last 50 years of data and projected it. And then I looked at the file which is, you know, like available in NatHERS, NatHERS current file, which represents pre-1980 climate, or around 1970. So this is the climate file that we are using now to design energy efficient building. So it's up to us to really understand how this thing is going in the regulatory setting. And then, you know, like in 2022, NCC updated, through NCC initiative, NatHERS updated climate file, and which is better than what we are using now, but again, it is representing climate we experienced just pre-2010. So that is where our policy is heading. And when you look at 2020, that is what it should be for now. And, you know, like 2030 and 2050 is what you see on this graph, which is it's going towards, you know, like more warming kind of scenario. So with this context, what we have done in this project is to look at all these climate scenarios and understood how the same house would behave in these scenarios. And again, just to give you, I presented very, you know, like high level kind of like data, looking at max, mean, and minimum. But if you really want to understand what the climate is really telling us in terms of heating and cooling, in terms of the comfort, this is what the current NatHERS climate is telling us, which has got really wide cool period and very short warm period for Western Sydney. And you can see the way you can read this graph is anything on the red is heat discomfort, whereas anything on the blue side is cold discomfort. But quickly you can identify the period which you will be experiencing that particular condition. And I have named that because summer, winter doesn't make sense. Climate had changed. We just stopped using that terminology. We need to look at the data and we need to tell when we are experiencing warm condition, when we are experiencing cool condition. And moving to the next one, you will see this is what the new climate file from NatHERS will take us through. And then what you will see again here is still we can see a fair bit of cool period, but warm period has extended, which is great. This is what we would like to see. But then one thing, what was missing, what is still missing from our regulatory setting is what is the current experience of the climate. And this is what I would say is the 2020 climate, because it has produced using a bit of data interpolation in the future and compiled with the real year from the data bank. And it uses a very similar method of pulling the data, but it's just based on the temperature. And what you'll see here is now it is balanced. So which is very much the current experience of the Western Sydney climate. And it really resembles our experience, because by November, people will start using air conditioner, which we know, and it will continue until March. And cool period actually starts from early May until mid-September. So this is what we are experiencing. So if we are designing energy efficient house now, I think this is what we should be taking. And going forward to 2030, what we can see again, the warm period has extended and cool period is still there, but the level of discomfort that you see in the warm period has gone up than what we have been experiencing now. And the same thing you will see in 2050. So this context is very important to understand the results that we come up with. So one thing is very clearly, we can say that NatHERS climate do not represent the currently experienced climate, which is something we really want to highlight it whenever the government is saying, okay, this is the file you use and you design, and then we'll certify the house is energy efficient or not. But looks like that's not the case. And just to give an idea, because when we are talking about climate change, we always think, okay, it will be more warmer and warmer. And yes, it is happening. So that's what pushing our average up. But what we will see here is the dominance of that temperature change in warm period is significantly high than what we will experience in cool period. So what you'll see is, if we take 2010, which is portrayed as a current kind of climate in NCC 2022, then in 2030 the change is 1.6 degree in mean monthly maximum, and the similar trend in mean monthly minimum as well. And going to 2050, it will jump up to 4.4. So if you design a house using NCC 2022 climate file, which is a new requirement from NatHERS, then still we will be way behind than what we will be experiencing in the future. So this is something we need to remember. But at the same time, what we can't discount is the level of heating we may need. We may still need a bit of heating. And whereas here the trajectory of the increase is very slow, and in mean monthly minimum it is very slow, or it will just stay where it is now. And mean monthly maximum is increasing but very slow. So with this the background, what we can see again here is number of hot days will increase, but number of cold days will not really decrease, it is decreasing, but very slowly. So definitely, what we need to do is we need to design building to ensure it will work during the warm climate, or cooling becomes important. And with that concept, and which Nick already touched upon, what type of dwellings we use for the assessment in this project, we used single-story building, double-story building, low-rise, high-rise buildings. And here what you can see is those 5 different climate scenarios used to assess the same design. And the design the starting point is they are complied with basics and with current NatHERS climate file. So you can see the line here, the bar represents the real heating cooling load, but a line represents the caps, basic caps. And as we move towards NCC 22 NatHERS climate file, then you can see some of them are failing, which is rightly so. And as we move towards current climate and the future climate, you can see that's become more prominent. And in some cases, you'll see it's not happening. So, for example, in low-rise apartment, it's not happening because basics allows that to happen, because they didn't change anything for those type of buildings. So what we can see is with this tick and crosses, the crosses are failing, like either in heating or cooling or in total, but ticks they are allowed to build. So with this context, what we realized, again, if we design based on that NatHERS climate file, NCC 2020 climate files, still that's not enough to cope, the type of heating we're experiencing. Will be still using more energy. And so how that is changing, the main change what we can see here is if at present the house is designed for like the balancing heating and cooling, would use significantly high energy for cooling in 2030 and 2050. So that really means if you fine-tune your house now in the climate file that is given, your house will suffer the most because you are fine-tuning for the climate that we experienced 50 years ago. So I would not recommend anyone to go to design 10-star house now in this kind of regulatory setting. That's the worst outcome will happen. And so in a way, it is the basics compliant dwellings in late 2023 means like from 1st of October, that will apply, and that will consume more than double the energy for cooling in future. So that is the kind of like situation we are in. And then we look at what will happen in the heat wave. So we looked at January 2017, and we all know, like if you can recall, we were in Sydney at that time, we experienced heat wave after heat wave. And so in this case, we've taken from 7th of January to 12th of January and looked at the scenario. What we found consistently, the room temperature is going way over the prescribed limit. So that is something beyond the thermal comfort, like given to us. So that really means even if your house is complied with all these regulations, that doesn't really mean your house is heat resilient. So this is something what we found. And the same thing what we can see in the apartments as well. And so this is the worst performing apartment in that particular block. And you can see, like the indoor temperature is pretty much, achieving similar kind of outcome with the outdoor temperature. So so that really means they are not designed for that kind of like resilience type of approach. And with that kind of like background, what we looked at is, yes, we all know there is a design strategies for the future climate we can derive using climate file, and these are some of them. I don't want to go into the detail, but if you look at it, what you will see is very simple design approaches. It's just like you need to recognize what's happening, and then you can derive design strategies, not a problem. But some of them are very much we could take in and we could implement. For example, we all know double-story houses are better than single-story houses because of it will offer the buffer, and the heat that is coming from the roof will be reduced significantly. So those type of approach can be used easily. And based on this understanding, what we did, we modified those houses to look at what are the things we need to do. And what we observed, we don't need to do much. For example, in single-story house, what we did, we just changed external wall color, roof color, and we added ceiling fans, and that was enough to satisfy for future climate, because we decided we don't want to change the design. So these are the some changes we made. And similarly in apartments, we changed glazing, we reduced glazing in some cases. So we're just looking at very cost-effective method to comply. And what we found, the other thing, very interesting one, is if you design for the future, then you could not really build now, because it has got heating and cooling cap and the total cap in basics. So what you will see here, the red, the number in red, it really shows it is exceeding the heating cap. So because that's what is the main issue. So whenever we say, okay, you should be designing for the future climate, then regulation is not allowing you to do that. And so that means we are actually promoting the design which for the climate which we may not experience, and then we are calling it energy efficiency. So that is the main issue we discovered in this project. But what we can see here in apartments, actually, even if we say, okay, 7-star will be the new requirement or will be implemented soon, but basics allows 6-star apartment unit to get through, because in apartments it's not possible to achieve 7-star for each apartment units. So what we found is, because of allowing that 6-star, it really allows you to do that, like achieving performance for future is easier. So that's what I really mean before, is if you are going and trying to achieve very high star rating, it is not really useful for the future climate. And obviously, when you design for the future, what you try to do is you try to reduce your cooling load from the outset. And with that, and if you bring it back to the present climate, then what you will see is your actual cooling load is very little. So that really means it allows, for example, the grid to upgrade and all these things to happen, because you have already designed to consider the future climate. So here you can see if that kind of like balancing was to start with, and if you come down and model that into NCC 2022, your cooling load would be slightly more than 20% with the same design. So I'm coming towards the end of my presentation, and so what we can see here is fact that dwelling universities in Sydney are currently designed for the historical climate, which we demonstrated through this research, and which do not represent the climate that we experience now or will be experiencing in the future. So that is the fact. And the consequence of that is, if we continue with that, then the building will be neither energy efficient nor heat resilient. So what we're trying to achieve with this regulation is the main question. And the response should be we must design buildings to suit the near future climate. So not we're looking for far future, but near future. And maybe we need to really build in, say, planned retrofitting the way it will be, like some of the things we can add on later at the retrofitting stage. And our recommendations are to, like the government should really adopt future climate files so that buildings will be designed for the future, at least, like 10 or 15 years to start with. And should allow buildings which is designed for the future climate, which is not the case in at present, which will restrict it. And also, what we notice, one very important thing is, so NatHERS cooling thermostat settings are outdated, because it sets thermostat for bedroom in a specific time. And what we experienced, even the house was designed well, it was achieving very high temperature during the daytime, and like after COVID, and even now, lots of people are working from home and maybe working from that particular like bedroom. So that really means all the regulation, which is trying to like restrict or facilitate energy efficiency, is not really happening with that kind of thing. And important thing is, which is not really included in our building code, buildings should be designed for thermally safe during extreme events, which is not really there. So that's something very important. So I'll stop here now. Kelly.
So thanks, Anita. That's great. So I'm here just at the end to kind of talk a little bit about impact, because that's what this session is called. And really, for Wesrock, we're not researchers. That is our role, to look at how we can start getting this stuff into policy and into practice on the ground. So that's really what we're after as well, because we're looking at serving communities. And for us, research is really important for identifying key issues, providing evidence to justify change to political leaders and communities, as is the case in this project, but also about guiding targeted investment. And I can see that in some of the recommendations that have been made as part of this. It's looking at, what's feasible, what's not, how can we moderate things to achieve different solutions. So this diagram here is just really useful because, science, as we all know, doesn't exist in a vacuum, and our role, I guess, is really looking at how we can get it to pass through the different requirements of government and industry and community acceptance to look at policy implementation in place. And also noting it's not enough simply to do the research, even though we're really excited about this research, not in terms of the outcomes, which are a little bit depressing, but definitely in terms of being able to demonstrate what's happening in place. So from the very beginning of this project, we were really careful to be aware of policy cycles. So from the very beginning, we were working and communicating with, the New South Wales Government as well as the National Construction Code team around this project. We really did have to work quite quickly because we knew there were some reviews coming up in the National Construction Code, and we wanted those policymakers to have this research, and we did actually release some preliminary findings or a draft report so that they could have that in time for it actually to be impactful, because we knew if we missed that, it would be many years before this was being reviewed again, and that was really important. And similarly for basics, we knew that those higher basic standards were coming in October 2023, so we really designed the project around demonstrating what the older basics, what the new basics, and what those future climates were going to look like. It's also really important to focus on translating the science, and I think Anita's done a really great job building the narrative in this report. It was really designed not just to be a research results report, but to be designed in a way that anyone could pick it up, that we could communicate it to political leaders, and also to people who we know are allies for change in this space. So not just built environment professionals who understand climate files, and it's been a huge learning curve for me personally, and I know Judith as well, but we know our colleagues working on public health policy, working on sustainability policy, but also looking at emissions reduction, but also the emergency management space when we look at the poor conditions that we're seeing during these heatwave events. All of those people need to be able to access this information to feed it up their chains and communicate to people in their sectors as well. And I think it's also important to not let the perfect get in the way of the good. Again, we're always for better practice. Practitioners need information when they need it, when the policy cycles are happening. So anything that can improve what we're doing now, noting that there will be more research happening in future, but we really need to have that ongoing dialogue to make sure what we know now is being fed into practice. And finally, I think being open to cross-disciplinary and cross-institutional research is really important. So I know for this particular, often we do that at Wesrock, we work with different institutions and different groups, and I think this research was really important to get off the ground with, the NCC Section J review and also basics, but we're really looking at how we can partner with, say, health sector researchers to look at what these conditions that we're seeing in this modelling really mean for real people. So looking at how we can build on what we already know to really understand the complexities of the policy challenge in place as well. This has just been released, so there's not necessarily been, change takes time and impact takes time, but I just wanted to run through a few things that we've been doing already. As I mentioned, we've been engaging with those different policy teams where we want to see that change. We've been writing letters to ministers and having meetings with ministers, and it was ordinarily communicating climate change and different climate files might be tricky, but thanks to the awesome narrative we have in this report, it was a lot easier than it otherwise might have been. We're also really thinking when we're developing this report, how we're going to communicate this to community members, because obviously they're the ones that are going to be demanding, better design. They're working with industry, they're consumers, they're also voters. So it's really important not to forget that element of the picture as well. And we've also been really keen to share the results with industry because we know they can be really powerful in testing best practice, looking at change, but also, sharing that and providing that feedback back to the policy setting as well. And because I know we have a whole range of researchers and academics in the room, Judith and I like to finish off with opportunities for future research because we're always looking to, deliver more impact and see improvements in the heat space in particular. Some of the areas we see there's, more research to be done is looking at heatwave definitions and thresholds, and that's both around, extreme heat events, but also looking at those planning overlays and how do we know where we do and don't apply different, policy controls around, addressing climate and heat. Data collection, if it's not measured, it can't be quantified or understood, and there's a lot more that needs to be done, as Judith's already mentioned, around, mortality impacts and human impacts, but even, place-based measurements of temperature inside and outside of buildings. Thermal safety standards, Annie's already mentioned that. We don't have them at the moment. What should they be? What are they going to cost? What kind of, costs and benefits are associated? Social practices are often left off and don't get as much attention. And as we've mentioned already, occupancy profiles, built environment performance also depends significantly on the people living in those spaces. So, how does built form and people interact? And finally, cost-benefit analysis, because one of the main questions we get is how much are these changes going to cost? And I think really understanding what that is, we can't make that argument unless we know. So, thank you for that. And I'll hand over to questions.
We'll start the Q&A sessions. Do you have any questions?
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you for that. It was very interesting, and thank you for inviting me. So I'm Sarah, I'm from the National Environmental Science Program, and I'm quite new to government, so a lot of the things that you were saying about, you think if the research is done, you just get the policy changed, and it's nice and easy. If only it was that easy. It would be. But one thing I was really interested to see was that the RCP that you used for a lot of the projections was 8.5. And I'm just curious what made you choose that particular RCP, and has that maybe impacted the way that government and other organisations relate to your findings, in that they may be using different RCPs and SSPs?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Camille. And what we when we started this project, what we learned from like the IPCC or the other UN agencies, what they were talking about is for 2030, definitely we are heading to that trajectory. So 2030 is something very close, and then whatever we do now, it would not really deviate us from RCP 8.5 scenario. So that's why we started with that, and then we just continue 2050 on the same trajectory. But one thing what I would like to highlight, because you asked this question, because these climate files are prepared by CSIRO for NatHERS compatible file, so that's why we have to rely on that. But when I analyze that file separately, it is not really what we are experiencing in 2030. We're experiencing way severe than that. So that is something very important that I presented in one of the other conferences earlier. So again, the results will be more severe than what we saw now. But the whole idea is the approach, like once we get the data, we can really redo this again. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you, and congratulations. It's such good work, and you really extended the study. And I learned a lot from you just today. That was wonderful. I just was wondering what response you've had from the New South Wales Government and the National Construction Code around the results. Have they been open to taking those results on board before the next upgrade? Or?
I feel it's a bit too early to tell. So both have been really open. They're really interested. We've also been liaising with the Australian Climate Service, who have been taking it on board and want to sort of run with it. Where it will end up, we're not sure yet. I might also pass over to Kelly. Kelly had a conversation with Minister at USIC, who is the chair of the Building Ministers meeting. He was incredibly interested and a little bit devastated that the recent updates made are actually not going far enough. And he was very interested in tabling that at his next meeting. So I think, like, if we don't do it this way, we do it. Did you want to talk a little bit more about that meeting?
Yeah, I think that covers it. Yeah.
So yeah, I guess hold this space, but yeah. And also just acknowledging the amazing work as we've been. So people in the audience here have done the first study that Nick Asher actually presented on, and that's been instrumental for us to build on and take it, particularly together with Anir as well, and Nick from WSP to do that specifically for Western Sydney and really look at heatwave as well.
Yeah, Judith, I was going to just add something to small wins. From the Eastern Sydney area study, we learned that the Waverley Council have actually adopted some of the recommendations out of that study in their policy guidelines for the DCT. So, take the small wins when they come along, for sure.
Hi Nick, it's Suze from the Council here, and Rach. And yes, it is true we were able to put not only into our development control plan, which is non-statutory, but also some changes around heat resilience and thermal safety, as we now call it, rather than thermal performance, into our local environment plan, which is a statutory instrument, so that's good. But I'm also interested, Ania, because it's so interesting to see the results coming from Western Sydney that look almost not as bad as the results that we got for Eastern Sydney. And knowing that we have the East Australian current basically having those ocean breezes is why we're not looking at any real, like our heating load will just drop off completely, but our cooling load is exponential going forward. Is the difference really just because there is that you need to retain that cooling and heating load going forward because of the minimums that are out in Western Sydney?
Thank you. That's really interesting questions, and I haven't really dived deep into it. But the way I can see is, one of the slide that I have presented about Western Sydney is how the temperature changing in warm period and in cool period. We can see that very dramatic there. But I haven't really looked at the same way for Eastern Sydney. But what I can, my hunch is that is slightly different in the East Coast because of the sea breeze that you get, and there is a mass to moderate the impact. So whereas in Western Sydney is inland, kind of like scenario where the temperature change is very significant. So I'll look at it and I'll get back to you because what it looks like, the same type of analysis for this part of Sydney. And one thing when you just raise it, I just want to highlight is science has developed a lot in last, like 5 to 10 years, particularly in climate science. So what I'm thinking is even Greater Sydney is representing by measured 2 climate files doesn't really make sense to me. Like the third one is for CBD for different purpose, but actually these 2, like climate zone 56 representing Eastern Sydney and which extends up to Parramatta, and then climate zone 28 for large part of New South Wales, not only Western Sydney. If you are designing a house in west of Port Macquarie, that is the climate file you use. So we need to raise question on that as well. So we have to do a lot in this space, and and I'm very keen to work with like industry partners and local government to make sure we are putting right legislation for the people to build. Like it's the time is running out. Actually, if you don't do that, then we are doing disservice rather than servicing people. Thank you.
I might be able to throw something onto that as well, Anir. Hi, Suze. Good to hear from you. Sorry I can't see you, but good to hear the question. As Anir says, there's a lot to sort of investigate further, I think, to unpack exactly the reasons why, but I'd suggest one of the other things is the idea behind what your starting position is for a compliant house or a compliant dwelling in Eastern Sydney compared to what looks like a compliant dwelling in Western Sydney, and how that skews some of the resultant levels of load difference as you go into the future scenarios. So it's probably a multifaceted issue behind why you saw one set of results in the Eastern Sydney study compared to Western Sydney as well.
Thank you. And any other questions for the presenters?
Thanks for that. You mentioned, Kelly specifically mentioned the process of translation and implementation for this. And I was just wondering if you were following any particular models or frameworks for implementation in how you were going about that now.
I would say it's an iterative process. So we generally, I guess it comes a bit second nature to us now, but we, do go through and identify all the potential touch points where we think there might be interest or we think there might be room to influence the system. But often it's really just getting into as many ease as you can and coming at it from different perspectives as well, because, overall, over time, if industry's saying we need to update standards, if community's saying, oh, my home, like I've just built a brand new home and I'm a bit worried now that my energy bills are going through the roof, if it's coming through all different channels, that's, I think we found is the best way to start getting people talking about these topics, which on the surface can be a lot of numbers and a lot of graphs and a bit complicated. But I think really in terms of the translation, it's really around building that narrative and building that understanding with different groups. And I think, we've seen that this obviously is a relatively recently released project, but the 2 other projects that Judith mentioned, Cool Suburbs and the Urban Heat Planning Toolkit, we've really seen over the last couple of years those being uptaken and people having a lot of conversations and councils, trying different things out and talking amongst themselves and getting that ecosystem of people talking about these topics and trying different things. And, that's often what gets it over the line. So it's not, necessarily always a straightforward process, but it's, tapping into people who are interested, who have the capacity. And I think for us as well, because we do rely on external funding and we are, a really small team, it's often about being pragmatic and, getting it out there. Did you want to?
And exactly what Kelly said about. So Westrock is an organisation. We are very small. NatHERS organisation. We can't make people do what we think they might need to do. So we do rely on all of our stakeholders in that networking and our research partners as well to say, okay, so we work with our research stakeholders, we work with our policymakers and our practitioners to try and package all of that up into something that's really practical and hopefully quite powerful. We do always spend a lot of time on the narrative, trying to make things as sort of easy to position as possible. But yeah, like Kelly said, it's not a straightforward process, and we always try to find our way, and it's quite iterative.
And sometimes it's a bit of trial and error as well with what resonates, with different groups, and because we don't always know, what types of policy challenges and other, issues that people are having to deal with in their policy domain as well. So yeah, sometimes it is a bit of trial and error with what's resonating, with different groups.
Yeah, we also got one more question from the online audience to Dr. Anne. So he's asking, are your future climate files available for download anywhere?
That climate file which we have used in this project is actually from CSIRO's data bank. So it's freely available. If you search, like future climate file and CSIRO in Google, it will come up, and then you just need to sign up and you can download the file.
Any other questions? If no questions, thank you very much, Anna, Judith, and Kelly, and also Nick, for joining our Impact BE Talk series. And thank you all for coming.